The silence in our kitchen that night was the loudest sound I have ever heard. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, crowded silence, packed tight with 15 years of unspoken truth. I remember standing by the sink, rinsing a single coffee mug, and my hands were perfectly steady. That was odd. Usually, when I felt nervous, my fingers would tremble. But that evening, there was just a deep, still calm inside me, like the eye of a hurricane. I think deep down, a part of me already knew what was coming. My husband, Thomas, was sitting at the oak table we'd bought together right after our wedding. It's a good, solid table. It has seen 2 children grow up, countless Sunday dinners, and quiet mornings with the newspaper. That night, it saw a marriage finally reach its breaking point. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the small, dark grain of the wood, tracing a circle with his thumb over and over again. He looked so small right then. Not physically small, but diminished, like a strong tree that had finally run out of sap. His shoulders were slumped, and his gray hair seemed to catch the weak overhead light in a way that made him look suddenly very old. I finally set the mug down on the drying rack. I didn't turn on the dishwasher. The thought of that whirring, mundane noise intruding on this moment felt disrespectful. "Are you going to tell me, Thomas?" I asked. My voice was just a breath, smooth and quiet. It held no accusation, no anger, only an enormous, bottomless weariness. He flinched. He looked up at me then, and his eyes, those familiar, kind blue eyes, were full of something I had never seen before. A desperate, drowning fear, and a terrible, crushing shame. Mary, I didn't rush him. I walked slowly from the sink and sat in the chair across from him, resting my folded hands on the cool wood. I waited. This was not a conversation that could be hurried. This was the final unwrapping of a gift nobody wanted, 15 years in the making. I knew the secret involved a woman I had known for years, not from any evidence, no telltale lipstick or late-night texts, but from the subtle shift in a man's soul. A quiet withdrawal that happens when he carries too much weight alone. Our love hadn't died. It had just been put on a shelf, dusty and untouched, because his heart was holding something else. "It's about Susan, isn't it?" I asked, naming the thing he couldn't. Susan, an old friend, a woman from his past who had moved away years ago. I met her once, briefly. She was vibrant, full of energy, and I remember thinking she was too dazzling for Thomas's quiet world. But they were just friends, old history. When Thomas started getting calls from her about 15 years ago, it was around the time her marriage was failing. I remember him taking the calls in the study. They were long calls, and he'd come out looking pale and concerned. "She's having a rough time, Mary," he told me. "Her husband just left her. She's alone out there." "That's awful," I said honestly. "Tell her I'm thinking of her." He said she was trying to pick up the pieces, that the divorce was hard. He was just being a friend, a supportive ear. And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? We were Thomas and Mary. We were rock solid. We grew into middle age gracefully, side by side. We watched our children grow up, graduate, and start their own lives. When the girls left, the house felt big for a while, but we filled it again with new quiet routines, long walks after dinner, or just sitting together on the porch swing, not needing to speak. That solid, quiet foundation was the most devastating thing about The Secret. A life built with so much care, on such deep assumption of truth, had been resting on a fault line. And I never felt the tremor. Susan had been Thomas's friend before I met me. They went to high school together. She was beautiful, artistic, and a little restless. She moved to the West Coast right after college, chasing a dream of becoming a filmmaker. I met her once, briefly. She was vibrant, full of energy, and I remember thinking she was too dazzling for Thomas's quiet world. but they were just friends. Old history. When Thomas started getting calls from her about 15 years ago, it was around the time her marriage was failing. I remember him taking the calls in the study. They were long calls, and he'd come out looking pale and concerned. "She's having a rough time, Mary," he'd told me. "Her husband just left her. She's alone out there." "That's awful," I said honestly. "Tell her I'm thinking of her." He said she was trying to pick up the pieces, that the divorce was hard. He was just being a friend, a supportive ear. And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? We were Thomas and Mary. We were rock solid. That solid, quiet foundation was the most devastating thing about The Secret. A life built with so much care, on such deep assumption of truth, had been resting on a fault line. And I never felt the tremor. Susan had been Thomas's friend before I met me. They went to high school together. She was beautiful, artistic, and a little restless. She moved to the West Coast right after college, chasing a dream of becoming a filmmaker. I met her once, briefly. She was vibrant, full of energy, and I remember thinking she was too dazzling for Thomas's quiet world. But they were just friends. Old history. When Thomas started getting calls from her about 15 years ago, it was around the time her marriage was failing. I remember him taking the calls in the study. They were long calls, and he'd come out looking pale and concerned. "She's having a rough time, Mary," he'd told me. "Her husband just left her. She's alone out there." "That's awful," I said honestly. "Tell her I'm thinking of her." He said she was trying to pick up the pieces, that the divorce was hard. He was just being a friend, a supportive ear. And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? We were Thomas and Mary. We were rock solid. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day, you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day, you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day, you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day, you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day, you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day, you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day, you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly fade on a wall that's always in shadow. You can't tell when it started, but one day you realize the vibrancy is just gone. And that was how our quiet life began to change without a single loud protest. The change in Thomas wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, steady erosion of our closeness. It was like watching a color slowly.
It was around this time, maybe a year and a half ago, that I started seeing a pattern. Whenever he went on one of his Tuesday or Thursday late-night work excursions, I would find one small, perfect lie that didn't hold up. One night, he came home late, exhausted, and said he'd been wrestling with a particularly difficult mechanical drawing at the office. But when he changed his shirt for the laundry, I noticed a tiny, faint, almost floral scent on the collar. It wasn't my perfume. It was too light, too elegant. I knew he hadn't been working alone. I sat on the edge of the bed and held that shirt, bringing the collar to my nose again. It was a sweet, sharp scent, and it didn't smell like betrayal in the usual sense. It smelled like hope. Someone else's hope for him, maybe, or his hope for a different life. And that was what hurt the most. The idea that our life, the one we built so carefully, wasn't enough to hold him here. I didn't mention the smell. I just put the shirt in the hamper. My strategy became silence. I knew that if a secret is kept long enough and with enough guilt, the keeper of the secret will eventually crack under the pressure of their own making. I decided to wait for the confession. I decided to wait for the full truth, delivered by him. Waiting for the truth is an agonizing thing. It changes your vision. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stage where a difficult play was being performed. I was the co-star, pretending everything was fine, while the director, Thomas, was trying to keep the script a secret. I learned to live with the heavy weight of suspicion. I spent my mornings watering the garden, watching the flowers bloom, finding peace in the simple certainty of nature. Flowers don't lie. They bloom when they should, and they die when they should. There is an honesty in that cycle I clung to. I felt myself pulling away, not out of anger, but for self-preservation. I started taking painting classes again, something I hadn't done since the girls were small. I channeled the enormous, unspoken sadness into color and brushstrokes. It was my way of building a new internal room where the loneliness couldn't touch me. One evening, about 6 months ago, Thomas and I were watching television. We were sitting side by side on the sofa, a perfect picture of a comfortable, settled couple. The news came on, and they showed a quick 5-second clip of a crowd at a political rally in a city about 3 hours away. And there she was, Susan. She was standing near the front of the crowd, laughing, her arm linked with a man's. And the man was not Thomas. He was taller, darker. I felt a confusing flash of relief and confusion. If she's with someone else, why is he still so strange? Then, the camera panned slightly, and behind them, standing near a banner, looking tired but alert, was Thomas. He wasn't laughing. He was standing slightly apart, in the shadow, holding a coat or a bag. He looked like an escort, a guardian, a background fixture. The news report was over in a blink. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned to Thomas. He was staring straight ahead at the screen, his expression completely blank. He had seen the clip. He had seen himself. I said nothing. I reached over, slowly, deliberately, and switched the television off. The screen went black, and our reflections stared back at us. Two strangers on a sofa. "You were there?" I stated, not asked. "At that rally, with Susan." He sighed. It was a sound of profound surrender, a sound that said the battle had been lost for a long time. "Yes, Mary," he said softly, still looking at the black reflection. "I was there." "Why, Thomas? Why were you 3 hours away? Why did you tell me you were stuck at the office until midnight that night?" He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes was not of a man caught in a simple affair. It was the look of a man who had been struggling under a weight so heavy it had crushed his spirit. "It's not what you think," he whispered. "It's not just a quick lie. It's bigger than that." That night, I realized I couldn't keep doing this. I knew I had to tell you the truth, all of it. I leaned back on the sofa cushions, feeling every bit of the 15 years pressing down on me. I didn't cry. The time for simple tears was long past. "Then tell me, Thomas," I said, my voice barely a sound. "Tell me the whole, complete truth. What did you hide for 15 years? And so we finally arrived at that kitchen table, with the coffee mug cooling on the drying rack and the silence so thick we could barely breathe in it. His confession was about to begin, and I knew, with a horrible certainty, that the story I thought was our life was about to be rewritten. Thomas looked across the kitchen table at me, and I saw a man finally relieved of a burden, even though that relief was quickly replaced by raw, exposed grief. He started speaking, and his voice was low, careful, like he was placing fragile stones on the table between us. "Mary," he began, his voice breaking only slightly on my name. "That night, 15 years ago, when Susan's husband left her, it was devastating for her. She had nothing. She was completely alone on the other side of the country." He paused, collecting his thoughts, staring past me at the wall. "I know I told you I was just talking to her, being a supportive ear, and that was true, mostly, but she needed more than a phone call. She needed help. She was falling apart." He finally met my eyes, and the shame in them was blinding. "I flew out there, Mary. I took a week off, told the office it was an emergency family matter, which in a way it was. I told you I was on a work trip in Boston, reviewing a new site." He took a slow, agonizing breath. "I was there for 5 days. I helped her pack her apartment. I helped her negotiate with her landlord. I helped her drive her belongings to storage, and I sat with her in that empty apartment while she cried. I listened. I didn't move. I didn't cry. My body felt like it had been turned to concrete, solid and cold. I simply absorbed the facts. The truth finally was a physical thing in the room. And during those 5 days, I asked, my voice flat, did you also betray our marriage? He winced, closing his eyes for a moment. Yes, he whispered. It was a terrible, desperate mistake. It was a night of pure emotional wreckage. She was heartbroken. I felt like a hero. And the lines of friendship just dissolved. It was meaningless, Mary. In terms of feeling, it was not love. It was just brokenness filling a hole. I nodded slowly. It was the answer I had prepared myself for years ago. A short, terrible, reckless mistake. It hurt, but I could perhaps understand human weakness. But Thomas, I said, leaning forward, that was 15 years ago. A one-time mistake. Why did you spend 15 years hiding? Why the late nights? Why the constant lies? Why was Susan still a secret last year? This was the core of the problem. A one-time slip-up hurts, but 15 years of deception destroys the foundation. Thomas leaned his elbows on the table and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders began to tremble. This was the moment the calm broke. Because, Mary,
It wasn't just a mistake, he choked out, his voice muffled. It had consequences. Huge consequences. He lifted his head, and his face was red, his eyes wet. He looked truly broken. Susan didn't tell me until 6 months after I came back. She called me, quiet and terrified. She said she was pregnant. The world stopped. The kitchen, the table, the chairs, everything vanished. There was only the sound of Thomas's heavy breathing and the impossible word hanging in the air. I tried to speak, but my throat was sealed shut. I shook my head, silently refusing the information. It was mine, Mary. It was my child. I finally found my voice, a harsh, unfamiliar sound. But, Thomas, you have never mentioned a child. We have never discussed this. Our daughters, Clara and Emily. I know, he pleaded. Susan decided to keep the baby. She moved further away, wanted to raise the child alone, wanted no scandal. She didn't want to hurt you either. She said she would disappear and never tell anyone. He reached a trembling hand across the table toward me, but I instinctively pulled back, holding my own arms tight around my chest. So, what happened to the child, Thomas? My voice was unnaturally steady. I was operating on pure adrenaline, pure shock. He's 15 now, Mary. He just turned 15. His name is Daniel. I closed my eyes. 15 years. A whole secret life, parallel to ours. Our daughter.
I did it to protect you, he insisted, tears running down his cheeks. I was terrified of losing you. I was terrified of what this would do to Clara and Emily. I thought if I just dealt with it quietly, kept it contained, no one would be hurt. I stood up, slowly, pushing my chair back with a scrape that sounded brutal in the quiet room. You protected your secret, Thomas, I stated, my voice like ice. You, not me. You kept yourself safe from the consequences while I lived here loving a man who wasn't fully present, who was always holding back a fundamental piece of his existence. I walked to the kitchen counter, needing the distance, needing a barrier between us. The sight of him, weeping at the table, didn't soften me. The betrayal was too deep, too long-lasting. It was a scar across my entire adult life. Why tell me now? I asked, turning to face him again. Why, after 15 years of careful deception, did you decide tonight was the night? He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Because Daniel knows. He's starting to ask about his sisters. He wants to know his whole family. Susan and I realized we can't keep him a secret anymore. It's not fair to him. It's a cruelty. And I couldn't stand to keep lying to you either. I need to face the truth, Mary, and I need to ask for your forgiveness. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. I looked tired, older than my years, but my expression was one of quiet, terrible resolve. I had waited 15 years for the truth. Now that it was here, I knew I had to handle it with the same quiet strength I had used to carry the suspicion. Forgiveness is a long way off, Thomas, I said simply. But the truth is a start. I knew the biggest question wasn't about him or Susan. It was about Daniel, a 15-year-old boy, innocent in all of this, a child who was suddenly my family, whether I was ready for it or not. And his existence changed everything. This section is now complete, bringing the narrative to the climax of the confession. The next planned segment is the resolution. I will now write the resolution section, focusing on the immediate emotional aftermath, the difficult initial decisions regarding Daniel, and the search for an answer to the 15 years of deception, while maintaining the required tone and pacing. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't go back to the bedroom. After Thomas finished his confession, he remained slumped at the table, a portrait of sorrow. I simply walked out of the kitchen, through the silent living room, and into the study. I closed the door gently. There was no need for slamming or shouting. The destruction had already happened quietly, 15 years ago. I sat down in the leather armchair and wrapped a blanket around myself, not because I was cold, but because I needed the physical weight of something solid. The hours passed in a slow, dark procession. I didn't think about divorce or anger or retribution. My mind was focused entirely on Daniel, a 15-year-old boy. He was not a choice. He was a human fact. He was a life that existed because of my husband's mistake, and he was completely innocent in the resulting web of lies. I realized that all the hurt I felt, the betrayal that ran bone deep, could not touch this child. If I let my pain dictate my reaction to him, I would simply be extending the cycle of secrecy and damage. That wasn't fair. When the first weak light of dawn began to gray the window pane, I felt a terrible ache in my chest, but I had clarity. My marriage was shattered, yes, but this boy needed stability. He needed a family, even a broken one. I walked back into the kitchen. Thomas was still there, asleep now, his head resting awkwardly on his arms, a piece of paper stuck to his damp cheek. He looked utterly exhausted. I poured a glass of water and set it gently beside him. The small clink of the glass woke him instantly. He looked up, panicked, expecting a torrent of rage. "Mary," he croaked, his voice rough from sleep and weeping. "Don't speak yet," I said softly, holding up my hand. "Just listen. I've been thinking, and I've come to a decision about one thing." I sat across from him again. The kitchen felt different now, less like a stage, more like a war room. "This is not about Susan. This is not about our marriage right now. This is about Daniel," I stated firmly. "He is your son. He is innocent. He has been hurt by this secrecy as much as I have, probably more so because he's lost 15 years with his father." Thomas stared at me, his eyes wide, disbelief and hope warring in them. "I will not be the person who shuts the door on him," I continued. "He needs to know his father, and I will not force you to hide anymore. You will continue to see him, but we will not lie to our daughters." That was the hardest part to say aloud. Clara and Emily, they were adults, but they were sensitive. They idolized their father. I stood up. "I need time. I need space. You will stay here, and you will work out the details with Susan about how Daniel comes into our lives, if he chooses to. But I cannot be here while you do it." I packed a small bag, a few clothes, my painting supplies, a favorite old book. I didn't take anything of sentimental value. I didn't want any reminders of the life that was now in question. "Where are you going?" he asked, finally finding his voice. He sounded terrified. "To my sister Carol's," I replied. Carol lived 3 states away. It was far enough. I need to breathe air that doesn't smell of lies. I need to figure out who I am now without the certainty of Mary and Thomas. I walked to the door, paused, and looked back at him. "The truth has done its damage, Thomas. Now we see if the truth can heal anything. Call me when you've told Clara and Emily, not before." And then I left. The house felt huge behind me, silent, waiting. The next few weeks at Carol's house were a blur of quiet routine. Carol was wonderful. She asked very few questions, just kept the coffee hot and the porch swing rocking. I spent my days walking by the lake and painting. I didn't paint anything specific, just swirls of dark blue and heavy gray, trying to get the confusion out of my heart and onto the canvas. I had several long, difficult phone calls with Clara and Emily. Thomas had called me first. his voice sounding hollow and exhausted, and told me he had shared the entire story with them. Clara, my eldest, was devastated. She was angry. How could he do this to you, Mom? How could he keep a whole secret family? I don't understand him anymore. Her anger was a comfort because it was direct and honest. Emily, the youngest, reacted with deep, quiet confusion. A brother for 15 years? I don't know how to feel about a stranger who was suddenly family, Mom. It's just strange. She was processing the practical reality of it, the addition to the family tree. I spent hours on the phone reassuring them that my love for them hadn't changed and that their father's failure as a husband did not erase his goodness as a father to them. I emphasized the innocence of Daniel. He's a boy who needs his father, I told them. We decide how much space we give him, but we don't punish him for Thomas's mistake. This resolve to protect Daniel was the anchor that kept me from sinking entirely. About a month later, Thomas called with a momentous update. Daniel was coming to visit. Susan agreed that a weekend trip to meet his half-sisters was the necessary next step. "Mary, I need you here," Thomas pleaded. "They need to meet you. You are the stability in this family. Please." I know it's a huge ask. I hesitated. Returning to that house felt like stepping back into the fire. But I knew Daniel was coming, and I knew that if Thomas handled this meeting alone, it would forever feel like a clandestine, separate event. It needed to be brought into the light of our home. "I will come home for the weekend," I finally agreed. "But it is for Daniel and the girls, not for you. We need to present a unified front for him." The drive home was quiet. As I pulled up the driveway, the house looked the same, but it felt radically different. It felt like a monument to a life I no longer knew how to live. The next day, Thomas picked up Daniel. The silence in the house was unbearable. Clara and Emily were nervous, quiet, sitting stiffly on the sofa. I was in the kitchen making lemonade, feeling like I was preparing for a hostage negotiation rather than a family meeting. I heard the front door open and then Thomas's voice, thick with emotion. "Girls, Mary, this is Daniel." I took a deep breath, and I walked into the living room. Daniel was tall and slender with Thomas's kind blue eyes, but his hair was dark and curly like Susan's. He looked terrified. He was holding his backpack straps tightly, standing close to Thomas like a shield. He looked at Clara and Emily, and then his eyes landed on me, the woman who had been cheated on, the wife of his father, the stranger who was now supposed to be something. I didn't rush him. I walked slowly over to him, kept my hands open at my sides, and gave him a gentle, quiet smile. "Hello, Daniel," I said softly, my voice filled with the warmth I reserved for my children. "I'm Mary. Welcome to our home." I saw the relief flood his young face. It was the first moment of genuine connection in the whole agonizing affair. In that moment, 15 years of deception didn't matter. What mattered was the boy standing in my living room needing a gentle word. I knew then that whatever happened to Thomas and me, Daniel was now woven into the tapestry of our lives, and I would treat him as I would any of my own.